Now, while these reconstructed state governments had provided blacks with a number of, or I should say, a host of different political powers and rights, the KKK really sought to undo them. The KKK, more than anything, was focused on making sure that blacks couldn't exercise their newfound political power. So they actually focused on, blacks and whites who were Republicans, elected officials, teachers in black schools. But what they really made sure to avoid was, again, federal troops, because they didn't necessarily want to draw the federal government in to stop them, but the federal government did. And so you're going to have something called the Enforcement Acts. Now, again, I know that sounds like the force bill. Don't confuse them. This is passed under Ulysses S. Grant, who is the Republican president that succeeds Andrew Johnson. So there's sort of three parts to the Enforcement Acts. First is it imposes penalties on anyone who interferes with any citizen's right to vote. Again, making sure that blacks and poor whites have the right to vote. Now it's going to send in federal supervisors and marshals to monitor the elections in these 5 districts, particularly in the areas where the KKK is the strongest. So it's going to bring in federal power to ensure that the first part, again, no one can interfere with their right to vote. But it's also going to have sort of a very specific KKK act where it's going to try to outlaw the main activities of the KKK itself. So it outlaws forming conspiracies, wearing disguises. Again, the KKK wear robes and masks. You can't resist officers. You can't intimidate officials. So again, it's using federal power to come down on those people who are, denying blacks the right to vote through terror and violence and intimidation. But unfortunately, it's not consistently enforced. So it's passed by Congress, signed by the president, but really not much is done to actually back it up. Now, in the Upper South, the KKK didn't play as much of a role as it did in the Lower South. And in the Lower South, its violence and intimidation really was successful to keep blacks from voting. And part of the reason that it wasn't consistently enforced, the Enforcement Acts, is that public interest in protecting civil rights in the South had really begun to wane. Again, it's a 12-year period from 65 to 77. And as you get into the 70s, it seems that the North is more focused on other things like westward expansion. There's Indian wars that are going on that we'll talk about. Both of those, expansion Indian wars after the break, and economic issues in the North, particularly around industrialization. And so these, white Democrats, the redeemers who are going to save the South from black rule, use the race issue to excite the white electorate and intimidate the black vote, particularly as we go into the election of 1876. So Grant had been president for 2 years. There's some thinking that he would run for a third term, which wouldn't have been illegal. It just would have gone against the precedent that Washington had set up. But he doesn't. So you're going to have Rutherford B. Hayes from Ohio and Samuel Tilden from New York, who is the Democrat. So both the Republican Hayes and the Democrat Tilden both agree on relaxing federal military authority in the South. Not necessarily doing away with it, but relaxing it. Now, the Republicans famously, quote, waved the bloody shirt. And so in order to get Hayes elected, they were trying to link the Democrats to secession, the Civil War, violence against Republicans in the South, saying, these are not good people. Now, in the end, actually, the Democrat does better than the Republican Hayes in the election. Tilden actually gets 300,000 more votes, and he gets 184 Electoral College votes, which just puts him one shy of the 185 that he needs. But there are 19 disputed electoral votes from Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. Again, the Deep South. The Democrats need 1 vote. The Republicans need all 19. But those disputed votes all came from states that were governed by a Republican who'd appointed the election board, and all 3 of those states actually reported narrow victories for Hayes. So Hayes thought he had all 19 of those wrapped up, but the Democrats challenged the electoral votes. So again, 19 disputed, Democrats need 1, Republicans need all 19. So there's this electoral commission that's set up, 5 House representatives, 5 senators, and 5 Supreme Court justices. Now, friends, obviously you can't have a 7.5 to 7.5, so it ends up being 8-7. Not surprising, seeing as though there were more Republicans on the commission than Democrats. But the commission results basically, the 8-7 decided that Hayes would get to be the president. But really, the reason that it's called the Compromise of 1877, or what I call it corrupt bargain, part 2 or 2.0, is that a deal had been made between the Democrats and the Republicans. The Republicans would get the presidency, and the Democrats would get the federal troops removed from the South for good. So we look at Reconstruction, this 12-year period, 1865 to 1877. In the end, Hayes removes the troops. As soon as these troops are removed, the Republican governments that had been created throughout this 12-year period fully collapse, and the redeemers, quote, redeem. And so what you're going to see is, any protection for black civil rights that had occurred in these 12 years is done. And new white governments rewrite their constitutions. They get rid of any carpetbagger, scalawags, and blacks who'd been involved in government, and then they cut spending. And so in many ways, what you're going to see is the Compromise of 1877 initiates the Jim Crow South, which in many cases, blacks are going to be looking at this and saying, wow, after 12 years, it seems that effectively the North didn't win the Civil War.